Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you here today. It's a great pleasure and an honor, and I'm delighted to be talking about our work that we do in our research team at INSERM on the relation between physical activity and incidence of Parkinson's disease in women from the E3N cohort. So before I start talking about this topic, I would like to give a few numbers to make you understand the importance of this. So these slides show the estimates from the global burden of disease on the number of patients worldwide, so in the whole world, in 2015. So you can see that there were 6 million patients with Parkinson's disease in the world in 2015. And you see that the number of patients increased by doubled between 1990 and 2015. So a big increase in the number of patients with Parkinson's disease due to the fact that we're living longer, and this is due to the aging of the population worldwide. When you compare it to other diseases and you look at the prevalence rate, so the frequency of Parkinson's disease, what you see is that, in fact, the prevalence rate have not increased for other diseases between 1990, but it has increased for Parkinson's disease. And this is confirmed when you look at the numbers in 2021. So in 2021, there were about 12 million people with Parkinson's disease in the world, and the frequency of Parkinson's disease has increased by 61%. And we believe that this is due to the population aging, but also to the fact that patients with Parkinson's disease are living longer now than they used to live. This is a few numbers for France. And so because, as I said, we are living longer, so the number of patients with Parkinson's disease is going to increase. And these are some estimates that we obtained by doing projections between 2010 and 2030. And you see that the number of patients with Parkinson's disease will increase by 60% in these 20 years. So this means that because the number of Parkinson's disease is increasing, we need to find ways to prevent the disease, to delay the occurrence of the disease. And before I talk about this, I need to give a few words about what's the current view of the progression of the disease nowadays. So what we know nowadays, and this has changed in the past 10 years, is that before the diagnosis with Parkinson's is made, so before the typical signs appear, tremor, trouble with stiffness, rigidity, etc., there's what we call a prodromal phase, over which there are non-motor symptoms such as constipation, sleep problems, depression, anxiety, and these non-motor symptoms precede the onset of Parkinson's disease, and this is what you show here. So while the frequency of the motor symptoms, the typical motor symptoms increase, they are preceded by these premotor symptoms. And the current view is that for some patients, this Parkinson's disease may start in the brain, but that in some other patients, Parkinson's disease may start in the gut, and the progression of the disease to the brain would be through the vagal nerve. And so this is important in terms of prevention. So usually we talk about 3 ways of preventing disease. There's primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention, which is what I will be talking today mainly, is about trying to prevent the disease before it happens. So before the mechanisms involved in the disease happen. Secondary prevention is when the disease has already started, so when there are these prodromal symptoms I was telling you about, then it's trying to stop the progression to the disease. And tertiary prevention is about trying to improve the symptoms in patients who are already with the disease. And so today I will mainly talk about primary prevention through physical activity. So this is a topic that was highlighted by the World Health Organization that defines six action steps to address global disparities in Parkinson's disease. And one of them was prevention. And when I talk about prevention, again, I'm talking about primary prevention, which means intervening before health effects occur through measures such as vaccination, behaviors, etc. And so today we will talk about physical activity. So we know, and Sabine in the next presentation will talk about this, that exercise, aerobic exercise in particular, is good for patients who have Parkinson's disease, and she will provide a lot of information about this. But there are fewer studies looking at whether physical activity can prevent or delay the onset of Parkinson's disease. So physical activity before you develop Parkinson's disease. So there was a meta-analysis of cohort studies published a few years ago. So what's a cohort study? A cohort study is a study where you include participants at baseline, what we call T0, that these participants are free of the disease. They don't have any problem. And then you follow them over time to see who are the persons who are going to develop Parkinson's disease. And at baseline and over the follow-up, you can also measure behaviors such as physical activity or diet. And you're going to see in your study who are the patients who develop Parkinson's disease and if there's a relation with these behaviors that you assess. So whether persons who do more or less physical activity have an increased or not or decreased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So when we did our study, there were 8 cohort studies that showed that there was a 20% decreased risk of developing Parkinson's disease in persons who had the highest level of physical activity. When these studies were conducted in men and women separately, there were 4 studies in men that showed a 10% lower PD incidence for increasing physical activity, and there were 4 studies in women only, but you see with fewer number of patients, and this is because PD is more frequent in men than women. And in women, there was no association with physical activity, but as I said, these were small studies. But these studies had limitations. One is that these studies didn't look at physical activity over the follow-up. They only assessed physical activity at the beginning of the study. So they didn't take into account changes in physical activity over time. And we all change our physical activity as we get older. And the more important limitation is that these studies didn't take into account what we call the risk of reverse causation. So I'm going to try to explain what is reverse causation. So as I said earlier, the diagnosis of PD, of Parkinson's disease, is preceded by a phase over which you can develop non-motor symptoms and subtle motor symptoms. And this phase can last many years. In some studies, it lasts even 10 or 15 years. And so this is what you see in these graphs, is that the frequency of balance problems in PD patients here in red and in blue in persons without Parkinson's disease, you can see that these balance problems were already present a few years before the diagnosis. So this is the number of years before the diagnosis. And the same is true for constipation. So you can see that the frequency of constipation increases, but it was already more frequent in Parkinson patients 10 years before diagnosis. And this means that these non-motor symptoms, for example, or motor symptoms, so here balance problems or constipation, they can change the way people behave. So for example, if you have constipation, you can change your diet before the diagnosis, or if you have balance problems, there's a risk that you fall before the diagnosis or that you change your level of physical activity. And so this is why it's important to look at the behaviors that we're interested in many years before the disease develops. So the objective of our study was to examine whether physical activity was associated with a reduced risk of Parkinson's disease in women from the 3N cohort study. I'm going to describe it in a few moments, over nearly 30 years of follow-up, using repeated measures of physical activity and taking into account the risk of reverse causation. And this work was done in our team by Berta Portugal, who was a student in our team, a very good student, and who led this work. So this is the E3N study. I'm responsible for this study. It's a study of 100,000 women, and I don't know if there's any participant of E3N here with us today. No? Okay. So it's a study of 100,000 women who were aged 45 to 60 years when they were included in 1990. And we have followed them since. You can see here that there's a 13 questionnaire that was sent to these women in 2021. And these women have given a lot of their time to research over the past 30 years. We have collected a lot of information on these women. We've taken blood, we've taken saliva on these women. And I forgot to say that these women were all members of MGEN. MGEN is the Social Security for Teachers. So these women were mostly teachers and very involved in this study for the past 30 years. And so when they started the study here in 1990, they didn't have Parkinson's disease. And then we have followed them over time to identify those women who become sick and developed Parkinson's disease. So we've done this. We ask them the question over it. In each questionnaire, we ask them whether they were treated for Parkinson's disease. And then since 2004, we also have access to the drugs these women use. So then we wrote to the women who said that they had Parkinson's disease to obtain the medical records from their neurologist. And these medical records there was a committee of experts who looked at the records to see whether the woman had Parkinson's disease or didn't have Parkinson's disease. And of course, there was a few women for whom we didn't obtain the medical records. And then we defined whether these women had Parkinson's disease based on the drugs they used. And so this is on the left, you see this is what we call the incidence rate of Parkinson's disease. The incidence is the number of new patients every year who develop the disease, and in red. And you can see that we compare this to the incidence of Parkinson's disease in women from Western Europe over the same period, and we were very happy to see that the rate was very similar. So we didn't miss many patients, for instance. And we identified 1,200 patients with Parkinson's disease over 20 years of follow-up. And this slide shows other cohort studies throughout the world, so in Europe, in Asia, or in North America. And this is just to show that you see this is the number of women in these cohort studies. And you can see that these numbers are really smaller than the ones that we identified in E3N. So this makes E3N a very nice study to study Parkinson's disease in women. So so in the questionnaires that these women fill every 2 to 3 years, we ask them many questions on their health, whether they are treated for many conditions. We ask them if they smoke, what kind of diet they have, what kind of behaviors, whether they drink alcohol, whether they are treated for many conditions. And we also assess physical activity. So physical activity was assessed over six questionnaires over time. And you can see that physical activity was mainly leisure activity. And so you can see that we asked them whether they did heavy cleaning, light cleaning, they took care of the household, whether they climbed stairs, whether they walked, if they had vigorous recreational activities, more moderate, whether they did sport, cycling, and do gardening. And we attributed a level of activity to each of these activities. And then we generated a summary measure of physical activity for each questionnaire. So the results I'm going to present you are based on nearly 99,000 women, of whom 1,200 nearly developed Parkinson's disease over 28 years, I've already told you. And so these are the main characteristics. At the beginning of the follow-up, they were aged on average 50 years. They were highly educated because these women, as I said, were teachers. You can see that the women who did more physical activity smoke less than the ones who did less physical activity. This is the number of children. So also the woman who did more physical activity had more frequently more children. And the women who lived in a rural place also did more physical activity than women who lived in urban regions. So these curves, I'm going to try to explain to you what they show. They show the trajectory of the physical activity level in Parkinson's disease patients and controls before diagnosis. So just look at the middle figure here. So this is the level of physical activity before the diagnosis in the patients, and this is the level of physical activity in the controls for women who were 73 years old here at the time of diagnosis. This was the average age of diagnosis. And what you can see is that the PD patient, the patients with Parkinson's disease already did less physical activity 30 years before they were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So the patients with Parkinson's disease had less physical activity than the persons without Parkinson's disease. But you can also see that here at about 10 years before diagnosis, the curve starts to fall down a little bit faster in the patients than in the controls. And this means that, as I said earlier, we think that the non-motor symptoms and the subtle motor symptoms that the patients suffer before the diagnosis make them do less physical activity already a little bit before the diagnosis. So in the 10 years before diagnosis, this has an influence on the physical activity level. So this slide shows the final results of the study. So because there was this 10 years over which we think that the disease is already present and has an influence of physical activity, then what we did is we looked at the risk of Parkinson's disease as a function of physical activity at least 10 years earlier. So we didn't take into account the last 10 years before diagnosis. And so this is what you see, and this is a measure of the risk. It's what we call the relative risk. And here is the women Q4 who were in the top category of physical activity. And you can see that the women in the higher category of physical activity had a 20% risk, lower risk of Parkinson's disease. And so this is what you see in this curve here on the right, is that there's a declining risk of Parkinson's disease when physical activity increases. And then, because we were interested to see if the level of physical activity in midlife, so many, many years before the women developed Parkinson's disease, was also protective, we did the same analysis, but with what we call a lag of 20 years. So this means that we looked at the risk of physical activity as a function of the risk of Parkinson's disease as a function of physical activity 20 years earlier. And we see the same results, so that the women who exercised more 20 years earlier had a 20% decreased risk of Parkinson's disease 20 years later. So in conclusion, our findings suggest that higher levels of physical activity are associated with reduced risk of Parkinson's disease that is not explained by reverse causation. And these findings suggest that physical activity may help prevent or delay the onset of Parkinson's disease, maybe by slowing the pathologic processes involved in Parkinson's disease. As I said, the analysis of the trajectories of physical activity showed that the patients had physical activity levels that were lower than the controls even 30 years before they developed Parkinson's disease, but that in the 10 years before the diagnosis, this difference increased due to the prodromal phase of the disease. And these findings reinforce the evidence in favor of the health benefits of physical activity and provide stronger evidence than previous studies in favor of this inverse association between physical activity and Parkinson's disease. These results are, I think, important for planning interventions for prevention of Parkinson's disease, especially in women who are a group that is less studied than men in Parkinson's disease because the disease is more frequent in men. So thank you very much. This is the students and the researchers who do the work with me. And we thank, of course, the persons who give us money to do this work, especially France Parkinson. Thank you very much.